What's going on? Jake here with Uncommon EDC, and today we're going to be taking a quick look at the Benchmade PSK, or Personal Survival Knife. This is another one on loan to me from the Apex Pass Around group, and funnily enough this time around, it was actually sent to me in error. So I never signed up to check out this particular model. It's supposed to be going over to Rob over at Rob's Nerdy Knives, but somehow ended up in my mailbox. I figured I have it, may as well make a quick first impression video before getting it back in the mail to Rob. And so the reason I never signed up to check out this model is that the PSK is actually an assisted opening. So you can see here, we've got this spring assisted blade. And although that's not a complete deal breaker for me, it's also not something I'm a huge fan of, and definitely not something I would typically seek out on my own. That being said, spoiler alert, this model really didn't do anything to change my perspective on assisted blades. Nothing wrong with them, it's just not really my preference. It's also quite pricey at around $450. This is the more premium version of it though. There's a slightly more affordable version that I think is $380. So I'll link to both options down in the description of the video if you're interested in checking those out. Now, first thing that comes to mind when I think of survival knives is probably fixed blades, to be honest. But the second thing that comes to mind is robust and rugged and beefy. And this is a larger folding knife, to be sure, at about 8.4 inches in overall length. We get as fairly generous 3.5 inches or so on that blade. I think 3.45 inches to be precise. So not oversized by any means, but plenty of edge there. Great drop point style blade, Magnacut on the steel. We've got a partial flat grind that tapers down to this ultra thin and slicey edge. And that was one thing that I actually found pretty interesting, is that the entire blade is pretty thin. Our blade stock's only about 0.11 inches in thickness. So fairly narrow blade, which again, I think is a little bit surprising on a survival knife, but that's when you're thinking of kind of like bushcrafting tasks and kind of chopping branches and things like that. But a lot of survival is also going to be things like food prep, and it's a more fine work that you can use that thinner, slicier blade, and it does have a nice thin, slicey edge on it. We also get these partial fullers that aren't completely cut out. I like the look of them, but I don't think they're really serving any sort of functionality. Great thumb stud here, it's well placed, and I love the red accent. It just gives that nice pop of color that contrasts over the otherwise all blacked out knife. Speaking of blacked out knives, we have a Cerakoted blade, which is another kind of interesting choice for a survival knife. That means that even though we have this 90-degree edge, you're not going to be able to spark a ferro rod with it because of that coating. Fortunately though, we do have a nice size sharpening choil, and that should accommodate probably up to a 1/4 inch or so ferro rod. I don't think you can fit a 1/2 inch ferro rod, but it should be able to accommodate a 1/4 inch, and at the very least definitely would be able to accommodate an 1/8 inch ferro rod. And so you can definitely use that for sparking rather than compromising your edge, which is going to dull it pretty quickly if you use that for sparking. And so you do still have that option because it is a fairly generous sized sharpening choil. Benchmade logo on the front, Magnacut steel and patent information on the back. So fairly minimal branding. You could definitely do without the patent information. Definitely wouldn't mind seeing that Magnacut tucked up against the blade either, but obviously it's their super steel. They want to advertise it. In terms of our handle, we get that 4.95 inch handle. So extremely generous handle size that easily allows me to get a full 4-finger grip, and incredible ergos on this one. Very, very comfortable. Fits my hand nicely. I'm really able to spread out as much as I want on here without worrying about my pinky falling off the end. Although if that is a concern, you can add a lanyard here. We have this generous sized lanyard hole as well. And so I found the handles to be pretty comfortable. I will say the swell in the interior portion of the grip doesn't feel completely natural to my hand shape, but it's also not uncomfortable. It's not a hot spot whatsoever. Get used to it pretty quickly, but it doesn't feel like an exact fits like a glove type fit in my hand, even though it's not uncomfortable. And so another thing I really like about the handle though, besides that sizing, is this scalloping pattern on the handle material. So I haven't mentioned the handle material yet. I think I mentioned we have a carbon fiber bolster, but you can see this darker black portion is a different material. This is actually G10. They polished it off really nicely where it's got this super slick feeling to it and feels almost identical to the carbon fiber, so you don't really notice the transition in materials. But both of them have that scalloping pattern, which, since they're somewhat of a slick material, does a lot to add to the overall grip in this knife. You're not going to be sliding around with or without gloves. It gives you a little bit of grip to keep you from sliding forward and backwards. Obviously, with the direction, it's not going to keep you from sliding up and down, but you really don't need it because obviously you're gripped down low on that knife anyway. So it does a really good job of adding some grip to that knife. Now, speaking of interesting choices, we've mentioned a few of them already. The axis lock is a really strange lock to use on an assisted knife. And so typically the main benefit of that crossbar style lock, or axis lock in this case, is that your hands are out of the way, your fingers aren't in the cutting path of the blade, and you can pull that back and just flick it closed. But as you can see, you really can't do that here because that spring is going to keep opening it back up. And so you have to manually push that closed, eliminating a lot of the benefit of that axis style lock. It is a nice ambidextrous style lock still, and that's not going to act as a deployment method. So something like the 9400 has a button instead of the axis lock, and it is a automatic knife. So you just push that button, it comes flying out, you push it again to disengage, and you still have to push it closed. And so I think that might have made a little bit more sense here. I think this would be a little bit cooler actually as an automatic rather than an assisted. We do still have a safety back here though, and so that locks up pretty tightly, and when you do that, you're not going to be able to flick it out. You can also engage it while it's open to make sure that you can't close it, but you really don't need to because the lockup is plenty on that. I wouldn't be worried about this accidentally closing on you. In fact, one of the things about it being assisted is that this really comes flying out of there if you flick it the same way you flick a manual knife, and it engages that lock super heavily, so much so that it seems to create a little bit of lock stick when you open it a little bit faster. And so I'm going to stop talking. You may hear an audible click, you may not, we'll see. So a little bit of an audible click. That one wasn't that bad, but sometimes when you let it fly open like that, it will catch. Oh, there we go. We had a really heavy one, and it's not just that audible click. You can feel it. It's a tactile response there that you can feel when you're trying to disengage that lock. It's a little bit tough, and you really don't get that when you let it open gently. So if you were to open this manually, which you can't do, but if you were to open it manually, it's really not going to lock up, and you can see no audible click there. It doesn't end up sticking. It's not something that happens every time, but something that's noticeable from when it opens with a little bit more authority. So another thing where the axis lock doesn't feel like a great lock for this. Now, in terms of the action though, it is good. It's really easy to flick out. I feel like it's a little bit slower, honestly, than just opening it manually, because you do have to put a decent bit more pressure, which is a good thing. It means it's not going to engage on accident in your pocket, but you do have to put a decent bit of pressure before it starts going. And then it's basically the same as if you were to have flicked it open manually. It doesn't seem to me like it's opening that much faster. And again, we have that really heavy lock stick on that one. And so for me, I would prefer just a manual version of this. Now, I know I've seen people have de-assisted this where it's just a manual knife, and apparently it works really well. It's ultra smooth, and the axis lock works great. And so that's definitely an option. I'm obviously not going to do that with this since it's not my knife, but definitely an option there as well. And so overall, I think it's a cool knife. Like I said, I think it's a little on the pricier side. I probably wouldn't have that much of an issue with the price if it were a knife that was just a little bit more appealing to me. And since I'm not super into assisted knives, it just really never stood a chance with me. It is American made though, just like all Benchmade knives. We have that deep carry pocket clip that you can see is slightly off center, but perfect. It disappears into behind the knuckles of your hand. So it is really well placed there, even though it's slightly off centered, and it is reversible. Again, fully ambidextrous knife with that axis lock, dual-sided thumb studs, and reversible pocket clip. So that's obviously great to see as well. Let me know what you think of this knife though down in the comments below. As usual, if you enjoyed the video, consider liking, commenting, subscribing, joining the channel as a member, or checking out some of my other videos. It all helps the channel out a ton, and I hope you have a great one. Take care.